I'm going to start by going over a few things on Canvas, and then we will finish chapter 7. And then I recommend you use the rest of your time today to work on that case study and a few other things that are due for the end of chapter 7. Okay. So we'll start by going to Canvas here and looking at your assignments. Okay, so upcoming assignments, again, we have that case study. So this is going to ask you to read a short case study about monkeys and the brains of monkeys. And I want you to type up your responses and then submit them here on the case study page. And then the other thing due for the nervous system is a cranial nerve worksheet. It's just a list of the 12 cranial nerves, their name, and their function. So again, what they're called, what they do. Remember to include in the function whether it's a sensory, motor, or both sensory and motor fibers together. And then the last thing for this week is the discussion questions. So if you go to discussions, you need to participate in the 2 discussion boards for this week. So nervous system questions, part 3, the last part for that, and then things you found confusing or interesting for week 4. Okay, so that will finish up for us the requirements for chapter 7 for the nervous system. And now let's finish up the material. If there are any questions about what to do, please put them in the chat. So I'm switching gears here. PowerPoint, okay. Okay, so when we left off last class, we had finished talking about the peripheral nervous system, and we had talked about our spinal nerves and our cranial nerves, and we had gone through briefly the cranial nerves. It's important for you guys to know your cranial nerves. I gave you some mnemonics to help you. I know it's a large chunk of information and it can seem a little daunting, so you want to break it down in a few different ways and you want to engage with that material. So what that means is you want to create flashcards, you want to fill out that chart, you want to create a mnemonic, you want to watch a video about it, you want to actively use that information in a few different ways to try to help you remember it. So cranial nerves, you have to know them, got to know their name and their function and what kind of fibers they contain. We're now going to switch gears and we're going to move to development and disease. And we're going to learn the causes, symptoms, and outcomes for a few different developmental disorders. And then we'll end by briefly explaining what happens to brains with aging as we age. So the first developmental disorder I want to talk about is spina bifida. This is an incompletion of the vertebrae. And so typically what you'll see with these patients is they're babies who are born and they have a little bit of their spinal cord protruding out. Typically it's at the base of their spine, so this is a lumbar sacral issue. If it's less serious, they may just have a small dimple or a little tuft of hair even. And if it's very serious, the whole spinal cord will bubble and protrude out. That's an open defect spina bifida. And this obviously is dangerous. We talked all about the ways we need to protect our spinal cord. And so if the spinal cord is protruding out from the body, that is not protected. And so that child will have to undergo surgery to help repair and place the spinal cord back into the vertebral column. And this is caused by low folate. So we talked about how the brain develops first as a tube. So during embryonic development, you first get the presentation of something called a neural tube. So the tube will form, and then one end of the tube will roll up and become the brain, and the rest of the tube remains as the spinal cord. If there is an issue with the closing of that base of the neural tube, that can be what causes spina bifida. And this happens very early in pregnancy. Again, that tube starts to form very, very early. We're talking like 4 weeks of embryonic development. So for most women, you don't even know you're pregnant at that point. 4 weeks is when you would miss your period. But you still need to make sure that you have the right vitamins, because what they've found is that the reason the tube doesn't close all the way is that the woman has low folate levels. And so if you think you might be pregnant or if you're trying to get pregnant, they recommend you just start taking a prenatal vitamin, and prenatal vitamins have a lot of folate in them to prevent this very thing. So if you're trying to get pregnant or you think you might be pregnant, just start taking prenatal vitamins because they'll have the folate levels to make sure that that neural tube closes all the way and you don't get an issue like spina bifida. Another issue that's caused by low folate is with the other end of the neural tube. So the spina bifida, the tube doesn't close all the way. In anencephaly, the bulb part doesn't form on the end of the tube, so you're not going to get a full brain development. Anencephaly is the name for a bunch of disorders where there's an absence of a large portion of the brain. So these are children who are born. If they're born, they usually die within a few hours or days, just because they're missing most of their brain, unfortunately. They're usually completely lacking in that cerebrum, so all four lobes of the hemispheres are usually missing in an anencephaly child. And again, this is caused by low folate, so it's really important to make sure as women, as we reach childbearing age, if you start to think that you want to become pregnant or you might be pregnant, that you just start taking prenatal vitamins and make sure you have appropriate levels of those nutrients. Anencephaly was also in the news a few years ago with Zika virus. Zika virus is another thing besides folate that can cause anencephaly. So that's what women were really concerned about, was if they got Zika virus while they were pregnant, it put them at a higher risk of having a child with anencephaly, so born missing most of their brain. And scientists are still not sure the exact link between Zika virus and the anencephaly. So that was in the news a few years ago with all of the concerns about Zika. And the important thing to keep in mind here is just that brain development happens really early in pregnancy, and so you need to, even if you're just starting to become pregnant or think you might want to become pregnant or trying to become pregnant, you got to take care of your body. You got to take care of your body because any issues are going to affect some really crucial processes even early in development. Okay, so let's talk about one last developmental disorder. This is cerebral palsy. It's a large group of movement disorders, all fall under cerebral palsy. They appear in early childhood, and you'll see with these kids, they have very poor voluntary muscle control. So their motor neurons are not connecting well to their skeletal muscles. 50% of them also will have mental retardation and seizure disorders. And this is caused by low oxygen, specifically during delivery. So if the child, while they're being delivered, has a cord wrapped around their neck, for example, or there's some sort of issue with the delivery, the first organ that's going to react to low oxygen is the brain. You can think about this even as an adult. The first thing that happens if you ever were to be in a fist fight or something and you choke someone out, the first thing that happens from lack of oxygen is they're going to pass out. And that's because your brain really needs a constant supply of oxygen. And it's the first tissue that's going to be damaged by low oxygen. And during childbirth and early childhood, brains are doing so many things. And so they're very susceptible to low oxygen. And low oxygen during childbirth can have some really serious consequences. And all of them are generally classified as cerebral palsy. And so a wide spectrum of disorders, but the thing they share in common is that lack of voluntary muscle control. Okay. So I want you to think about examples of disorders caused low folate or low oxygen during birth. And let's talk finally about aging brains. Now, aging brains, this is my area of research. I am an Alzheimer's researcher. That was what my PhD work was in and my fellowship work was in. So I could talk about Alzheimer's for, well, probably a whole class, but I'm going to save that. I'm just going to tell you one slide about what happens to our brains as we age. And we'll start with infant brains. So infant brains, you're going to increase in size as you move from an infant brain to an adulthood. And what is happening is not a change in the number of neurons. Remember, neurons, you're born with virtually the number of neurons you're going to have for your life. But what change is those neurons are going to make connections with other neurons. So shown in the picture on the bottom here are what the neurons look like at birth. You can see that they're kind of spindly. At 7, they form a bunch of connections. And so every time you learn something, that learning is encoded in your brain by 2 neurons reaching out processes and forming a synapse with each other. So as we age, our synaptic connections are going to increase like crazy. We're also going to myelinate all of our neurons so that we can speed up that transmission. Starting in late childhood through puberty, you're going to start to do something called pruning or neural pruning. And pruning is where your brain goes through and it takes away any extra connections. So connections that it's made that you don't really need, you don't use, it's going to get rid of those and it's going to sharpen and strengthen the connections you use all the time. So the pruning is going to enhance your learning and memory capacity by strengthening really important networks, really important connections between neurons. And pruning actually happens when you sleep. So it's important to sleep. It's important to sleep before an exam because you want to prune, you want to enhance and do away with synaptic connections. And this is what we talk about with brain development. And it goes on, women will usually finish the majority of their pruning. So you'll still prune new memories, but they'll finish the majority of their pruning for emotional decision making and all of that by around 20. For men, it's up into their mid 20s. But the system is still plastic. So when we talk about plasticity in the brain, we mean that your brain is capable of change. And your brain is most capable of change when you're children, and we start to lose that plasticity as we age. What that means is if you get a brain tumor in a child, for example, yes, very serious. You can do surgery and remove the tumor. That part of the brain that's missing, you may think that they'll have a functional deficit. So say they lose part of their brain from a tumor that was in the region that controlled the sensation in their arm. Well, for a short period of time, maybe they won't be able to feel their arm, but brains are plastic in that that function can be taken up by another part of the brain. So another part of the brain might be like, I see we don't have sensation in our arm. We really need sensation in our arm. Guess what? I'll do it. I'll also be arm sensation. And so your brain can shift around those functions. The most capacity for that, highest capacity, is when we're kids, and we start to lose that as we get older. Our brains become less plastic, which is why tumors and strokes in old people, you're going to see some serious side effects. So not only as we age do we prune, lose our plasticity, but we also start to lose brain matter itself. And most of this is caused by a lack of blood circulation. So problems like heart disease, obesity, diabetes, all of that is going to affect the amount of sugar and the amount of oxygen going to your brain. And that is believed to be the #1 trigger for dementia and associated disorders. So a decline in memory and a decline in cognitive ability and thinking ability. So I want you to keep in mind that we're born with a set number of neurons. We'll increase our connections and our myelin to start, and then we'll prune them away. Our brains start as very plastic, and they lose that plasticity as we age. And then eventually you can have periods of you can have disorders associated with cognitive decline, things like dementia, Alzheimer's, and most of them are caused by an underlying circulatory issue. Okay, so that is the end here of chapter 7. We have reached the end of chapter 7. So with that, I'll take any questions people have. Otherwise, you should use the rest of this time to work on that case study. I'm around if you guys have questions.